Hi, welcome to another episode of Bright Threads in the Tapestry, a series where I piece together the brightest threads from my favorite stories and analyze them to figure out what makes them shine. Today we will be looking at what, in my opinion, is a momentous game of chess from The Summer Tree, which is the first book of the Fionavar Tapestry trilogy by Guy Gavriel Kay. I will be touching upon spoilers for the first book. I'll be covering events almost to the very end of the first book. I won't be spoiling anything from the second and third books of the Fionavar Tapestry. If you are looking for a spoiler-free introduction to the Fionavar Tapestry or the Summer Tree, the first episode of Bright Threads should have you covered. I'll link that in the description. I will eventually also make a short thoughts and impressions video on the Summer Tree or the Fionavar Tapestry, depending on whether I finish the trilogy by the time I get to it. So that is also available if you're just looking for some discussion on the book spoiler-free. Now, back to this game of chess that I mentioned. We have just a quick, tiny recap of the Fionavar Tapestry in case you read it a long time ago and are unaware of what the scene, or have forgotten, what the scene is that I'm referring to. So we know there are 5 people from the University of Toronto. I think that's the university where they're all taken from. Lauren Silvercloak brings these 5 people to Fionavar, specifically to the kingdom of Parastarval, which is ruled by Ailel. And they are brought there for a celebration. I think it's the 50th anniversary of his crowning. And I forget the right word to use there, but anyway, we'll call it that. Coronation. Yes, thank you. So it's the 50th anniversary of his coronation, and these 5 strangers are brought to Parastarval, except one of them gets lost and lands somewhere completely different, and we go back to him about 2/3 of the way into the book. Paul Schaefer, one of these group of friends, who is brought to Fionavar by Lauren Silvercloak, has recently suffered a great loss. His partner, I think it's unclear at this point whether it was his girlfriend or fiance or wife, but he lost his partner recently. We don't really know how. We just know that he is mourning her very deeply, is barely able to carry on. And his friend, Kevin, who has been his friend for a long time, really suffers for him as well, because he's worried about the fact that he's unable to help him. He feels helpless. He's looking at Paul from a distance because he doesn't seem to be able to do anything to help Paul recover from his loss. Now, and we see all of that at the beginning of the book. I think it's pretty much in the first chapter, the little snippets of information we get about the lives of each of these people. It's kind of amazing to me how much all of that plays a role in later on in the book. What we learn about them in that first chapter, how it resonates throughout the book and even the entire series. And maybe one day I'll do a bright thread about just that first chapter, what we learn about each of our characters in the first chapter, because it also played the role of really getting me attached to all of them. It's a theme similar to what I discussed in the previous bright thread, which is just how quickly I'm able to get attached to Kay's characters. But since that's very similar to the previous bright thread, I will postpone that discussion for later. Meanwhile, what we learn about Paul during that early chapter is that he's lost a loved one, and Kevin is looking on helplessly as he's basically sort of zombieing through life and in a great deal of mourning and not really able to recover from her death. So for me, one of the saddest things, or like one of the saddest but brightest threads in this book were Paul's hanging at the summer tree. Every time we got back, so I think, if I remember correctly, I read this book a few months ago, but if I remember correctly, at the end of every chapter, after this chapter that we're about to look at, which is about 80 pages of the way into a 400-page book, every chapter up to about, let's say, 2/3 of the way in, has events happening elsewhere, and then we keep coming back to Paul and what he's going through at the summer tree. It's over a period of 3 days, and he needs to be alive for the 3 days for the sacrifice to be effective. We'll talk about what that means in just a second, but we follow him over the course of 3 days. And by follow him, I mean more follow his thoughts as he's dwelling on his past, as he's fighting through needing to stay alive, even though what he wants more than anything is to let go of his suffering at the death of his partner, Rachel. And he's also dealing with some guilt over it. And it's just a lot of very deep, very intense insight into Paul's character that I thought was brilliantly done. It was and they were also, for me, some of the most beautiful sections of the book. And for that, they were all the more heartbreaking because they were on such a sad subject, but the prose was so lyrical and beautiful during those sections. It contributed to the intensity and added a lot of depth and sadness to that. So what I plan to do is a series of Bright Thread episodes where we look at different sections of Paul's time at the summer tree. I won't make them back to back because they are just too intense. I will intersperse them with other things whenever it's Fionavar Tapestry's turn to be a Bright Threads episode. So, but I will cover Paul's time on the summer tree in some detail because those were my favorite sections of the story. And this scene that we're going to look at is sort of the beginning of it all, if you will. This interaction with Ailel is what leads to Paul deciding to make the sacrifice. And I really loved the scene for its own merit, for how it was written. The description of the chess game was, I thought, really brilliantly done. But also the deeper layers, knowing what we know about what happens with Paul's character, what happens with Ailel later on. I think coming back and looking at this game of chess, it added a whole other level of depth and understanding to it that I want to look at today in the Bright Thread episode. So there are 2 short-ish scenes that I want to look at. So we'll only go as far as the game of chess in the interaction between Paul and Ailel. There is a third person who enters the scene after the game ends. We'll skip over those parts because they're not super relevant to what we are discussing today. And then there's a second scene where Paul understands about the sacrifice at the summer tree. So those are the sections we'll be looking at today. I will start by reading the first section. I will have timestamps in the description for those of you listening to this on YouTube. I can do this. I'll have timestamps in the description so you can skip over the sections where I'm reading the passage in case you'd like to read it yourself. I'm also sharing my screen so that you can read it yourself if you'd prefer it that way. All right, here we go. So a reading of the game of chess, or Tabayal as it is called in Fionavar, between Paul and Ailel. We will then discuss this in some detail. That night, very late, Paul Schaefer was summoned to play Tabail with the High King of Brennan. The escort was a guard he didn't know, and walking behind him down shadowy corridors, Paul was inwardly grateful for the silent presence of Coll, who he knew was following them. It was a long walk, but they saw few people still awake. A woman combing her hair in a doorway smiled at him, and a party of guards went by, sheathed swords clinking at their sides. Passing some bedrooms, Paul heard murmurs of late-night talk, and once a woman cried out softly on a taken breath, a sound very like a cry that he remembered. The two men with their hidden follower came at length to a pair of heavy doors. Schaefer's face was expressionless as they were opened to his escort's tapping, and he was ushered into a large, richly furnished room, at the center of which were two deep armchairs and a table set for Tabail. "Welcome." It was Gorleus, the Chancellor, who came forward to grip Paul's arm in greeting. "It is kind of you to come." "It is kind," came the thinner voice of the king. He moved out from a shadowed corner of the room as he spoke. "I am grateful to you for indulging an old man's sleeplessness. The day has worn heavily upon me. Gorleus, good night." "My lord," the Chancellor said quickly, "I will be happy to stay and—" "No need. Go to sleep. Tarn will serve us." The king nodded to the young page who had opened the door for Paul. Gorleus looked as if he would protest again, but refrained. "Good night, then, my lord, and once more my deepest well wishes on this brightly woven day." He walked forward and on one knee kissed the hand of Ailel extended. Then the Chancellor left the room, leaving Paul alone with the king and his page. "Wine by the table, Tarn. Then we will serve ourselves. Go to bed. I will wake you when I want to retire. Now come, my young stranger," Ailel said, lowering himself carefully into a chair. In silence, Paul walked forward and took the other chair. Tarn deftly filled the two glasses set beside the inlaid board, then withdrew through an inner doorway into the king's bedroom. The windows of the room were open and the heavy curtains drawn back to admit whatever breath of air might slide in. In a tree somewhere outside, a bird was singing. It sounded like a nightingale. The beautifully carved pieces glinted in the light of the candles, but the face of the tall king of Brennan was hidden as he leaned back in his chair. He spoke softly. "The game we play is the same, Lauren tells me, though we name the pieces differently. I always play the black. Take you the white and begin." Paul Schaefer liked to attack in chess, especially with white and the first move. Gambits and sacrifices followed each other in this game, designed to generate a whirlwind assault on the opposition king. The fact that the opposition in this knight was a king had no effect on him, for Schaefer's code, though complex, was unwavering. He set out to demolish the black pieces of Ailel just as he would have those of anyone else. And that night, heartsick and vulnerable, there was even more fire in his game than usual, for he sought to hide from the torment in the cold clarity of the black and white board. So he marshalled himself ruthlessly, and the white pieces spun in a vortex of attack, to be met by a defense of intricate, resilient subtlety. Whatever Ailel had dwindled from, however his mind and authority might seem to waver, Paul knew, 10 moves into the game, that he was dealing with a man of formidable resources. Slowly and patiently, the king ordered his defenses. Cautiously, he shored up his bulwarks, and so it was that Schaefer's freewheeling attack began to exhaust itself and was turned inexorably back. After almost 2 hours' play, Paul tipped over the White King in resignation. The two men leaned back in their chairs and exchanged their first look since the game had begun. And they smiled, neither knowing, since there was no way they could know, how rare it was for the other to do so. Sharing that moment, however, as Paul raised his silver goblet to salute the king, They moved closer, across the twin gulfs of worlds and years, to the kind of bonding that might have allowed them to understand each other. It was not to happen, but something else was born that night, and the fruit of that silent game would change the balance and the pattern of all the worlds there were. Ailel spoke first, his voice husky. "No one," he said, "no one has ever given me a game like that. I do not lose in Tabail. I almost did tonight." Paul smiled for the second time. "You almost did. You may next game, but I'm not very certain of it. You play beautifully, my lord." Ailel shook his head. "No, I play carefully. All the beauty was on your side, but sometimes plodding caution will wear down brilliance. When you sacrifice the second rider..." Ailel gestured wordlessly. "I suppose that it is only the young who can do a thing like that. It has been so long for me, I seem to have forgotten." He raised his own cup and drank. Paul refilled both goblets before replying. He felt drained, simplified. The bird outside, he realized, had stopped singing a long time ago. "I think," he said, "that it is more a question of style than of youth or age. I am not very patient, so I play the way I do." "In Tabail, you mean?" "Other things too," Paul answered after a hesitation. Ailel, surprisingly, nodded. "I was like that once, though it may be hard for you to credit." His expression was self-deprecating. "I took this throne by force in a time of chaos and held it with my sword in the early years. If we are to be a dynasty, it begins with me and follows with Diarmid, I suppose." Paul remained silent, and after a moment the king went on. "It is power that teaches patience. Holding power, I mean. And you learn the price it exacts, which is something I never knew when I was your age and thought a sword and quick wits could deal with anything. I never knew the price you pay for power." Ailel leaned over the board and picked up one of the pieces. "Take the queen in Tabail," he said. "The most powerful piece on the board, yet she must be protected when threatened by guard or rider, for the game will be lost if that exchange is made." "And the king?" said Ailel Dan Art. "In Tabail, you cannot sacrifice a king." Paul couldn't read the expression in the sunken, still handsome face, but there was a new timbre in the voice, something shifting far under the words. Ailel seemed to notice his discomfort. He smiled again, faintly. "I am heavy company at night," he said, "especially tonight. Too much comes back. I have too many memories." "I have too many of my own," Paul said impulsively, and hated himself the instant the words were spoken. Ailel's expression, though, was mild, even compassionate. "I thought you might," he said. "I'm not sure why, but I thought you might." All right, so now let's unpack this scene. If you are watching the video version of this, you probably see the intense amount of color that I have on this page. I have highlighted basically the entire scene that I read because I had a lot that I thought was very important as I was reading my way through the book. These are highlights that I created as I was reading the book. And as I was rereading it now to make this episode, I realized that we were told about events to come in this line over here. It was not to happen, referring to, the possibility of a deeper friendship between Ailel and Paul. It was not to happen, but something else was born that night, and the fruit of that silent game would change the balance and the pattern of all the worlds there were. So we know that Paul sacrifices himself to go in Ailel's stead to the summer tree, and that he inexplicably survives the encounter with the tree, so to speak. He also seems to have the power of the god Mornir when he's done with that, when done with that whole episode of hanging on the summer tree. So that's what this is referring to, it seems like. Now, I didn't know at the time I read it what it meant, but now it was foreshadowed in this game. And this game, I remembered, was important because of the interaction between Ailel and Paul, and that leads to the cascading set of events of Paul sacrificing himself at the summer tree. That's what I remembered it for. But also, it's further. It's more than that. It's not just the aspect of Paul's sacrifice. It's what comes off of it. It's the fact that he does survive his time at the summer tree, and I think a god, I want to say possesses, that seems to be the right word to express what happens to Paul there with Mornir. A god ends up possessing him, which, makes sense that it would change the balance and the pattern of all the worlds there were. And this is also because anything that happens in Fionavar resonates in all the other worlds, because Fionavar is the first of all worlds. Which concept, by the way, I find endlessly fascinating. It's absolutely brilliant. Now, so I see that that's been foreshadowed even in just this scene. The author is noting the significance of this game as well. I just noticed that. I love that. Now, before we get to the game itself, every time we've encountered Paul, there is this brooding quality to him. He is in mourning, and it's clear every time that he's basically dragging his feet through his life and existence. And who he is missing, or what he is missing, is made plenty clear to us each time. And that's the same here too, at the beginning of this scene where he's walking with the guard and Coll on his way to Ailel's chambers. It was a long walk, but they saw a few people still awake. A woman combing her hair in a doorway smiled at him, and a party of guards went by, sheathed swords clinking at their sides. Passing some bedrooms, Paul heard murmurs of late-night talk, and once a woman cried out softly on a taken breath, a sound very like a cry that he remembered. So, Paul is in a foreign place, and the setting is completely different from what he's used to. He's here from 20th century University of Toronto, in some place that feels like several centuries before on Earth. And so he seems to be noticing a lot of sounds and sights as he's walking his way through to Ailel's chambers. And yet there are small things that still remind him of Rachel. A sound very like a cry that he remembered. So there's a sort of melancholic quality to Paul's remembrance of Rachel in this aspect. In this particular instance. I'm not sure I can say what about the way the sentence is structured that makes it so, but maybe it's everything we know about Paul and the fact that while noticing all these other things, anything that reminds him of Rachel sends him off into a remembrance or a thought about her. Maybe it's also telling us about the recency of his loss. But yeah, I appreciated the depth that it added to Paul's character each time we were given more information or more insight into his mourning. That makes me sound morbid, but Paul's character I thought was really well done, and his grief overall I thought was handled really well, especially during his time at the summer tree. So every time we see him and there's this brooding quality, the tiny pieces that build that picture, I think, work really well to overall give us a sense of Paul and the loss that he's suffering at the moment. Now, the game of chess itself, I thought, was supremely brilliantly described. I am not too familiar with chess myself. I mean, I know the rules and I know what each piece does, I suppose, but I don't know how to play a game with the right strategy and whatnot. Like, I don't know how to create openings and basically try and win a game. But still, not that there's a lot of description of the game itself. I thought this scene read brilliantly. I really got a sense of how this went, and it felt like a very intense battle, which I suppose, well-played chess probably is. And I love the words that are used here. He set out to demolish the black pieces, and he sought to hide from torment in the cold clarity of the black and white board. There are some things, again, that we learn about Paul here. One, the fact that he's not... he's playing the way he normally would, despite the fact that he's playing someone who presumably has a great deal of power. And it's not that he doesn't recognize the king's power. He is, to a certain extent, at the king's mercy. He is, after all, summoned to be here late at night and keep the king company. And while he's at Fionavar, he's sort of at the king's mercy. So it isn't, let's say, ignorance of his circumstances that's keeping him, that's allowing him to play the way he normally would. He seems to recognize the king's power, but he's choosing to ignore it when deciding whether to play his usual game or not. So I love that. I really respect that sort of self-esteem in a person and therefore in characters. So I appreciated Paul's character more in this, and also the fact that we learned this about Paul in this scene is really interesting, I thought. And this also tells us later on when Paul stands up to, I forget, I think it might be Ailel, but he stands up to someone and tells them off for the way they were planning something. He's the only one to do so. So we're given sort of the pieces here to piece together Paul's character and explain his later behaviors as well. And then Ailel, who later on explains this explicitly, is playing a game of defense. And once again, the words that are used here, the king, slowly and patiently, the king ordered his defenses. Cautiously, he shored up his bulwarks. All of that to show the kind of careful man that he is for now. I thought the game itself was described extremely beautifully. I loved those two paragraphs, how they work together. And then once they finish, this is possibly my favorite line, the one I'm about to read. The two men leaned back in their chairs and exchanged their first look since the game had begun. And they smiled, neither knowing, since there was no way they could know, how rare it was for the other to do so. So this line, apart from how I thought it was beautifully written, but apart from that also, this is, I think, if I remember correctly, the second time that we meet Ailel on the page. But we've met Paul several times, and we've encountered the brooding and mourning aspect of his character. So knowing now, this line therefore is now information about the king, because we know that Paul probably hasn't smiled. Like, that's not really news to us because he's sad, he's mourning, but we don't know that about the king. So neither knowing, since there was no way they could know how rare it was for the other to do so. So this is really telling us that the king also has recently had very little reason to smile, which again seems reasonable. There is drought in the land that the king has to deal with, and his elder son is exiled for some reason that we're not familiar with yet at this point in the book. And so, yeah, like if you think about it, if you think back to all that we know at this moment about the king, it makes sense that the king would also have little reason to smile. And I think that adds a sort of depth to his character, because it tells us that the king is sensitive. He's probably worrying about his people for the potential suffering the drought is causing. He probably, maybe, just a guess here, might be reading too much into it, but possibly missing his son, because at this point here, I believe, when he says, "I took this throne by force in a time of chaos and held it with my sword in the early years. If we are to be a dynasty, it begins with me and follows with Diarmid, I suppose." So there is an ellipsis there, which basically means that he had to possibly stop himself from saying Ailerin's name. And earlier we find out that saying the elder prince's name is a crime, or is avoided, at least. I think, I don't know if we find out yet that it's punishable with death, but it does seem to be something that the king is unhappy about. We could read that into this passage, I think. And then this conversation about power, where the Ailel explains to Paul about the price that must be paid to hold on to power. And here he says that he talks about how the queen must be protected, because even though she's the most powerful piece, or because she is the most powerful piece, and then goes on to say, "And the king, in Tabail, you cannot sacrifice a king." So once again, that's foreshadowing for what we are told. Almost immediately at the end of this scene, we have a visit from one of the Leos Alphar. And then when Paul goes back to Coll and talks to him, which we will look at that scene, we find out that the king, for reasons, doesn't want to sacrifice himself at the summer tree. And here he's saying, in Tabail, you cannot sacrifice a king. Maybe he's justifying the fact that he's not offering himself up for sacrifice to save the land from drought. Perhaps that's what he's doing here. And I thought that was interesting, the foreshadowing here. The other two things that I liked in this passage, both on related subject, basically about how Paul and Ailel connected with each other. Here it says, this is immediately after the description of the game, where they both leaned back and exchanged their first look since the game had begun, and they smiled. So they were both finding a moment of joy. And then sharing that moment, however, as Paul raised his silver goblet to salute the king, they moved closer across the twin gulfs of worlds and years to the kind of bonding that might have allowed them to understand each other. So this tells us that they are kindred spirits, so to speak. They are both sad about something, and they both really enjoy this game that they just played, and possibly they'll find other things to connect over. But immediately the possibility is taken away from us. It was not to happen, but something else was born that night. So the possibility of potentially that each man might find a bit of joy in this friendship and maybe suffer a little less for the things that they are sad about, that is not to happen. That I thought was, well, I want to say it's a very deep observation, and it made me feel really sad knowing, as I did at this point, the depth of Paul's sorrow, and through this passage, possibly the depth of the king's sorrows and the loss of their friendship here. First, we don't expect Paul to stay very long, but if he did, they're probably not going to be able to bond anyway. But then a little bit of connection, we find out, has happened anyway, where they share with each other that they have too many memories. Ailel seemed to notice his discomfort. He smiled again, faintly. "I am heavy company at night," he said, "especially tonight. Too much comes back. I have too many memories." "I have too many of my own," Paul said impulsively, and hated himself the instant the words were spoken. Ailel's expression, though, was mild, even compassionate. "I thought you might," he said. "I'm not sure why, but I thought you might." So this was brilliant for me because they exchanged no words. They didn't even look at each other during the course of the game, because here we are told the two men leaned back in their chairs and exchanged their first look since the game had begun. And yet, possibly from the way they each played the game, they both deciphered some information about the other, gleaned some information about the other. And Ailel acknowledges that and says, "I thought you might. I'm not sure why, but I thought you might." So just the fact that they got that much about each other from this completely silent exchange, I thought the scene was brilliantly done. Now, the next scene we'll look at will be the scene where Paul actually finds out about the summer tree, and we'll look at that in a bit of detail. Okay, so the scene where Coll explains to Paul about the king's role in ending the drought at the summer tree. They passed through the hallways of the palace, their footsteps echoing. Beyond the walls, dawn was just breaking in the east over Gwen Istrath. It was dark still in the palace, though. Outside his doorway, Paul turned to Diarmaid's man. "Coll," he asked, "what's the tree?" The burly soldier froze. After a moment, a hand went up to rub the broad hook of his broken nose. They had stopped walking. Parastarval lay wrapped in silence. For a moment, Paul thought his question would not be answered. But then Coll did speak, his voice pitched low. "The summer tree," he said. "It's in the wood west of the town. Sacred it is to Mornir of the thunder." "Why is it important?" "Because," said Coll, lower yet, "that's where the god would summon the High King in the old days when the land had need." "Summon him for what?" "To hang on the summer tree and die," said Coll succinctly. "I've said too much already. Your friend is with the Lady Riva tonight, I believe. I'll be back to wake you in a little while. We've got a long ride today." And he spun on his heel to walk off. "Coll," the big man turned, slowly. "Is it always the king who hangs?" Coll's broad, sunburnt face was etched with apprehension. The answer, when it came, seemed almost to be against his will. Princes of the blood have been known to do it instead. Which explains Diarmaid last night. Coll, I really don't want to get you in trouble, but if I were to make a guess at what happened here, I'd guess that Ailel was called because of this drought, Or maybe there's a drought because he hasn't gone, and I'd guess he is terrified of the whole thing, and Lauren backs him because he doesn't trust whatever happened at the summer tree. After a moment, Coll nodded stiffly, and Schaefer continued. Then I'd go on to guess, and this is really a guess, that Diarmaid's brother wanted to do it for the king, and Ailel forbade him, which is why he's gone and Diarmaid is heir. Would that be a good guess? Coll had come very close as Schaefer was speaking. He searched Paul's eyes with his own honest brown ones. Then he shook his head, a kind of awe written into his features. This is deeper than I can go. It would be, he said, a very good guess. The High King must consent to his surrogate, and when he refused, the prince cursed him, which is treason, and was exiled. It is now death to speak his name. In the silence that followed, it seemed to Paul as if the whole weight of the night was pressing down upon the two of them. There is no power in me, Coll said then in his deep voice. But if there was, I would have him cursed in the name of all the gods and goddesses there are. Who? Paul whispered. Why, the prince, of course, said Coll. The exiled prince, Diarmaid's brother, Ailel. So a little bit of context must be set for the discussion of this scene. First, the conversation with Coll starts with Paul asking the question, what's the tree? With a capital T. The tree is mentioned for the first time. I think it's the first time. When Ailel refers to it in just before this scene, in the scene just before this one, where Ailel explains to Paul, I'll read this little bit of section. Leave me, friend Pwyll, Ailel said at length, not unkindly. I am weary now, and will be best by myself. Weary, he repeated, and old. If there truly is some power of darkness walking the land, I can do nothing about it tonight unless I die. And truly, I do not want to die, on the tree or otherwise. If this is my failing, then so it must be. His eyes were distant and sad as he gazed out the window towards the woods far off. So, this is a pretty cryptic passage. There's a lot that we don't understand that is immediately explained. But there is enough of a sense of mystery that's created by this paragraph that when Coll gets to the point where he says the king is summoned by Mornir to hang on the summer tree and die, it is extremely chilling. And we are built up to that, the atmosphere, which is that it's the night is just passing and dawn is starting, but it's still dark in the palace. Everybody's still quiet. So this atmosphere of silence where dark thoughts are entertained. The king telling Paul that I don't care to die just this night. And before this, he also had an argument with Brennan. That's the Brendel, the Leos Alphar, who's come to visit the king, about the drought and what it means for the land and for the king. So we've had an angry discussion just a little bit before that ended well, but now the king is declaring that he's weary and that he doesn't care to die on the tree, implying that he does need to die to bring about something good. So this, if there truly is some power of darkness walking the land, I can do nothing about it tonight unless I die. It almost feels like the king is giving up, but not really. That's what we find out when we get to the explanation of the summer tree. The king is actually desperately holding on. So knowing how little the king wants to die, it is quite, I guess it was disturbing to some extent to find out about just what he needs to do to fix the drought in the land. And this is also where we find out about why Ailel was exiled. The king feels strongly enough about this. He said earlier that the king cannot be sacrificed. He meant in Tabail, but he possibly also meant, knowing what we know now, in real life, that he cannot sacrifice himself. And it is unclear at this moment whether he is quote-unquote selfishly hanging on to life, or if he thinks something worse might come out of going and hanging at the summer tree. Because here he says, Paul guesses that the king is terrified of the whole thing, and Lauren backs him because he doesn't trust whatever happens on the summer tree. Now, I don't know what reason Paul has to think that Lauren doesn't trust what happens at the summer tree, because the only information he has is that Mornir summons the High King to hang on the summer tree and die. Maybe the summer tree as a concept is something that needs to be distrusted. That seems to be Paul's guess anyhow. So there might be an aspect of nobility to the king's refusal to go hang at the summer tree, but so far it feels somewhat selfish. But we have just been acquainted with the king and have developed deep sympathy for him, found out that he's sad about something, maybe not quite in mourning, but just he's an old king at the end of his prime. The other thing that was cool about that chess scene earlier is that the king tells Paul that you might not see it that way. You might find it hard to believe it right now, but I used to be like you, where I was impatient and I, basically took what I wanted rashly. But now he's shoring up power and is unwilling to lose it easily, to make sacrifices that he needs to be able to gain what he needs to. He is definitely unwilling to sacrifice his son, and he does not want to sacrifice his own life either. But so we find out that a man who is no longer in his prime, but is now someone we could be very sympathetic towards because of just how that game went and how sad he seems to be. I ended up, I don't want to say because I don't think there's enough for me there to like or dislike this character, but there was enough for me to feel sorry for him, that this is his fate, that these are the choices he needs to make at this point. So I thought this scene was very powerful, and possibly the most powerful line of all in this scene was, "To hang on the summer tree and die," said Coll succinctly. He didn't beat about the bush. He didn't try to explain it in some detail. He just said it like it is, and it was deeply chilling that what he did say. So this leads to Paul offering himself as sacrifice to the king, and the king, since it's not himself or his son, it feels like at the moment that he's okay to let Paul make that sacrifice. And maybe, just maybe, he's aware of how much Paul is suffering, possibly because of his interactions with him during this game of chess. So he was willing to let Paul make the sacrifice because it is in some ways also a favor to Paul, because he wanted his life or his sacrifice to mean something. He is at this point extremely ridden with guilt about Rachel's death and is trying really hard to make it through, but it seems to be that he's contemplating giving up, and in so doing he now has the chance to make that mean something. So he offers himself up as sacrifice. And maybe the king, Ailel, realized what that might mean to Paul, and so was not being entirely selfish when he allows Paul to make that sacrifice. So, with all that said, that was today's episode of Bright Threads. I will see you again next week with a bright thread for The Curse of the Mistwraith, which is the first book of the Wars of Light and Shadow series by Janny Wirtz. Thank you so much for listening. I'll see you next week.